It was a very windy Thursday night. I was standing on the edge of a football field alongside some assistant coaches, backed by 30 to 40, like pristinely cut, trimmed, healthy athletes, freshman football players to be specific. And we were on the edge of victory against the other team that was undefeated in the league this year. And the thing about this night is that the wind was blowing one way down the field. So when we got the ball with the score tied, with just seconds left on the clock, we had 70 yards ahead of us and like a 40 to 50 mile an hour wind right in our face. Now, I'm sure you could imagine a freshman quarterback's throwing arm is very developed, you know, at 14 years old, and should be able to pick apart the defense at that point. But you know what? Our guy was struggling just a little bit. Puberty had escaped him. And so we elected to just take a knee and let the clock run out and jump into overtime. Now, one of the dads didn't really understand the concept of overtime because he leapt out of his seat from the top row in the bleachers. And over 40-mile-an-hour winds, I could hear his feet pounding the bleachers. I thought he was going to leap the fence and take my life in that moment because he thought we had given up. But instead, we engaged overtime. And this cool thing about overtime is this 10-yard lines, freshmen, you know, we're not going to be too deep. 10-yard line, you got 4 chances to score. It's basically how it works. Our defense stops them. Score is tied. We get 4 chances to score. And if we score, we win. We're undefeated. These children become legend, right? And so everything was weighing on this moment. The first 2 plays were an utter fail. Just didn't work at all. I don't remember how far we had to go, but it was not less than 10 yards. And I'm thinking, man, you know, there's this finite time as a coach when you got to call the play. You got to decide what to do, you know, like there's the time from when the play ends there's a fixed amount of time before the next play has to begin, or you lose another 5 yards. And in that time, several things have to happen. You have to take in the information of what happened on the last play, the situation that you're in, the condition of your players, and then you have to essentially execute a miracle. Because what has to happen is that coach has to say through the ear hole of a helmet of a 14-year-old boy all the things that are true about the next play so that 14-year-old boy can go and tell another 14-year-old boy on the field exactly what he just heard so that quarterback can then tell 10 other players exactly what they're supposed to do. They can all go to the line and start it at exactly the same time, right? That's a lot to happen in like 20, 25 seconds, right? I don't know if you've ever played the game of telephone. It never works. It's fun, but it's not helpful. If only, I'm standing there in this moment, you know, we've got 2 plays left, we've got a long way to go. If only there was a way to extend the time between when you realized what you had to decide and making the decision. If taking in the information in the time where you had to speak out what was going to happen next, if only you could extend that time and just slow things down a little bit. If urgency could just be taken out of that equation, you had just a little bit of extra time. If you could just push pause on the game for just a minute and back up and think and calm yourself, that would be really, really helpful. If only there was something in the game that would let you do that. You know what it's called? Timeout. A timeout. There is very few things as helpful as a timeout when urgency is not your friend and important decisions have to be made between the moment you hear something and the moment you say something. If there could just be a timeout, maybe the next thing that would come out of our mouths would be way more helpful, be a little more thought out. I think the same thing is true in our relationships. That in our relationships, no matter how long you've been in a relationship, no matter who you are, no matter how old you are, whether you're in a marriage, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, a neighbor, a coworker, whatever your relationship is, there is this window of time between when you hear something and when you speak. And especially when you hear something that surprises you or offends you, or I don't know if you're like this, but there are people who come to me and say things, and my first thought is, that's totally wrong. And I feel like it's my job to immediately correct them, right? There are things that catch us off guard, that offend us, that hurt us, that surprise us, that we didn't see coming. And if only in our relationships we could take the time between that moment and the moment we speak and just stretch it out just a little bit, maybe the next things that come out of our mouth would be a little bit more helpful for our relationships. Last week we talked about how to listen really well in our relationships. Next week we're going to talk about how do we speak helpfully, right? We all have things to say. Not all of them are helpful. We're going to talk about speaking helpfully. And what we're going to talk about this week is how do we make sure there's enough time between those two things that we actually help our relationships forward, that I don't know about you, but for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is not always the best thing that could come to mind. So we're going to talk about that. Here's the question for today. What happens in the time between hearing and speaking? And if we use that time well and time that right in our relationships have a much better chance of thriving, which is really what this whole series has been about. We believe that every single one of us has relationships. Can I get a little nod, little little something that says, yep, we all have them, like it or not. You live next to somebody, you work for somebody, somebody works for you, right? You have kids, you have parents, all that stuff. We all have relationships. And I would also submit that every single one of us wants to be really great at them. We want our relationships to be awesome. We want our marriages to thrive, and our kids to love us, and our parents to be honored, and our neighbors to not talk to us. But we want to get along. We want every relationship to be really great. But here's the other thing, is because relationships always involve people, they always get messed up. Always. Always. Because people are in them, and we're messed up. And we bring our messed upness into the relationship. And then we start throwing messed upness at each other. We'll get it in a minute. Anyway, it's a mess. We make a mess. But here's the other truth, is that every single one of us can get better. And we believe God is extremely interested in helping us be great at relationships. So we're pursuing wisdom. In fact, God has offered a ton of wisdom to us, not only from generations of people who've lived before us, but also had recorded in His Scripture, there are some books of wisdom, some real life experience of people who lived well and said, I'll offer you this to help you live well. You can learn this the hard way by screwing it up, or you can just trust me and take this wisdom and run with it. And that's what we've been doing. In fact, many of us have been reading a chapter of Proverbs every day. It's 31 chapters. Just choose today's date and read it. And what we're finding is that there is awesome wisdom that helps us live more skillfully, especially in relationships. So I want to show you just a few, and let's just play a little fill-in-the-blank game for a minute, okay? Let's talk about when the time between when we hear something offensive, hurtful, surprising, and the time that something comes out of our mouth. What happens when that time is very compact and very short? When we respond immediately. When the time between those is short, what happens? Fill in the blank. Short-tempered people do what kind of things? Short-tempered people do really thoughtful things, right? That doesn't sound right to life experience, does it? No. Short-tempered people do things that they're proud of, right? Has that been your experience in life? That has not been mine, but maybe what God has said in the Proverbs will ring true is that short-tempered people do foolish things. Anyone done foolish things when you were short-tempered? When you were tired? When you were not at your best? When you were caught off guard and offensive and the thing that came out of your mouth, you're like, ah. And now you got two problems, right? The problem that was there before and the problem that just came out of your mouth, right? How about this one? A hot-tempered person shows great what? Patience? A hot-tempered person shows great empathy. I feel you, you know? A hot-tempered person shows great compassion. No. A hot-tempered person shows great foolishness. There's a nod, right? That sounds a little more true to our experience, right? Maybe God knows what's up, okay? Hot-tempered person does what else? A hot-tempered person starts great conversations. Hot-tempered person does lots of really helpful, positive things. Or a hot-tempered person starts fights. Which one sounds true, right? We can head nod. Even if you don't trust Jesus, even if you're not even sure about this whole Bible thing, you're like, yep, that's real life. That's real, that's daily, that's Tuesday afternoon right there, right? That's 10 minutes ago before my family got out of the car. That's right? And usually what happens when we listen, it comes quickly, even though the Scripture says we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. Sometimes we're slow to listen and quick to speak, and what comes out is harsh words. And harsh words make tempers subside. Nope. Harsh words make tempers flare, yeah? Tempers flare, and all of a sudden now we're in a battle royale, right? If we could just get better at this relationship thing, if we could just take some time out, just take this time out, maybe less often when people come to us with surprising or hurtful or uninformed things that bother us, that upset us, instead of shrinking that time and responding with harsh words or hand gestures or facial expressions that are not helpful, and the next thing you know, your relationship's going like this. You're both sitting in tears somewhere with T-Swift on repeat talking about bad blood, you know? Instead, maybe if we would just call a timeout and pause, because we're not at our best under pressure and under urgency. If we could just call a timeout and stretch things out. In fact, the other half of almost all those Proverbs I read to you, I'll show you in just a second. But first, this is one of those confrontational parts of Scripture where it's like, oh, I wish that wasn't true. But when I look at this, I gotta be able to say, listen, if the shoe fits, I gotta wear it. Because in Proverbs 12:16 says this, a fool is quick-tempered. And this is the hard part of when I am quick-tempered. I walk away and I'm even more mad. You know why? Because I feel like a fool. You know why I feel like a fool? Because I was a fool. I was an idiot. I was dumb. I responded with sarcasm. I responded with attack instead of understanding. All the time. And fool, I just hate to wear it. In fact, if we sat down with a computer right now and we just pulled up Google Maps and put on the satellite option, I could zoom you in on the basketball court behind my elementary school, where in 5th grade, this little punk looked at me and said, you're a fool. I don't know like how to measure blood pressure, but whatever the max capacity of my body before exploding was, that happened like that. And I started chasing this kid, and he's lucky the bell rang, because I probably am too. I could tell you what he was wearing. I could show you the spot on the basketball court. I could even tell you how tall he was because he was shorter than me. And man, I don't like that label. I don't want to be that guy, the one who does dumb stuff, the one who knows better, the one who should have known better. But the truth is when we're quick-tempered, that's usually how we end up feeling, because it's true. So let me show you the second half of those Proverbs and see if God knows what he's talking about. What happens when the time between listening and speaking is longer? What if we could extend that time? What if we could just call a 30-second timeout and just pause for a minute before we speak? It says this in Proverbs 14:29. It says, people with understanding control their anger. Right? We have a name for this when we're 2 years old. It's called a temper tantrum, right? Some of us never grow out of it. But people with understanding control their anger. A hot temper shows great foolishness. Or the other half of Proverbs 15:18 says this, a hot-tempered person starts fights, but a cool-tempered person stops fights. A cool-tempered person stops fights. Man, that sounds a lot more helpful. Sounds a lot more productive. Sounds like a relationship could really get better there. Or better yet, here in Proverbs 15:1, when we're ready to speak, a gentle answer deflects anger. Harsh words make tempers flare. A gentle answer. You see, gentle it has nothing to do with weakness. Right? What we do when we let our temper fly off is that we power up, or we try to control things. Either we're afraid and we attack, or we're hurt and we withdraw, and tempers just kind of flare up, and all of a sudden it's about something it wasn't always supposed to be about anywhere along the way. Now we're fighting about something else, or everything that person has ever done wrong. Because let's be honest, we've been keeping a list, and so it's like, I'm going to put all that out there. Now it's about something else, and the relationship has no chance. Instead of fighting for one another, we're fighting against each other. Instead, a gentle word, which for a lot of us takes a little bit of time to develop. A gentle word. Gentle is strength under control. Imagine a bodybuilder holding a baby. It's not a lack of strength. It's a matter of control that leads to safety in that moment, right? It's the same thing with our words. And sometimes a little bit of thought, a little bit of care helps us into that. If a fool is quick-tempered, the second half of Proverbs 12:16 says this, a wise person, which is how I would like to think of myself, how I want to be, stays calm when insulted. That, my friends, is hard to do. Can I get a yeah? A little uh-huh? Right? It's so hard when we're insulted. Right? It's so hard, but I'm so glad that God helps us. In fact, Jesus modeled this for us, right? Jesus is at the center of our faith. We say we want to join Jesus. We want to be like him. We want to be shaped by him. We want to live more like him. No one was more alive than him. And yet he took insult after insult after insult, and over and over and over. He rebuffed those. He moved on. He kept focus on what was really important. Even at the end of his life, through 6 mock trials and his eventual death, like a lamb before the slaughter, he was silent. He was able to endure insult because he knew who he was. He knew who God said he was, and whatever anybody else said didn't much matter, and so he was able to stay calm even when insulted. What if we could do that? Do you believe that your relationships would be better if you stayed calm when you're insulted? If you take a record, take a little inventory of the times where you popped off with a hot temper or kept yourself under control, which one of those generally went better? Right? We're better when we stay calm. Emotions are great. They really add so many things to life, and they're really great indicators, like the dashboard of your car. They indicate some things about what's going on in us, but they're really, really bad masters. When they're in control, when we allow our emotions to control us, we usually don't like how things turn out. And so it's not that emotions are bad, but what if we could keep calm? And so here's what we want to do. We just want to do what we did on the side of that field one day. What if we just call a timeout? How do we stay calm? What if insult became a trigger for a timeout? What if those times where we were offended or drawn back, instead of our instinct being sarcasm or power up or run away or all these other things, what if it just became, boom, timeout, I got to back up, and just create a little bit of space? So what we're going to do for the next little bit is just talk about how to do that really well in relationships. How can we have great timeouts in our relationships, right? This is what we do with our 2-year-olds anyway, yeah? When 2-year-old's totally out of control, what do? Time out. You just got to chill, because in like 30 seconds, you're going to see this thing differently, you know? Some of us, a timeout could treat us well. So let's just talk about it. Number one, if we were going to do a timeout really well, we should set a link. In the middle of a game, a timeout is a fixed amount of time. It is not an excuse to run away, right? That windy Thursday night, 60 of us did not walk off the field at a timeout, right? That's not what happened. A timeout is just a break that helps you step back from the immediacy of what's going on in the action and think a little bit clearly, gather things together, gather our thoughts, and then come back with greater effectiveness. The same thing is true in a relational timeout. Just push pause, step back, and say, all right, can we talk about this in like an hour? Can we come back to this tomorrow, right? I don't know how many times for you, but whether it was friendships in college or now in marriage or other things, sometimes those conversations start about the time you want to go to sleep. You know what I'm saying? And now everybody's at their best, right? Nope. Can we push pause on this until then? Right? Not an indefinite pause, but set a length. Or you know what? There were some people that in our church were going through a tough time. They really saw some things really differently, and it caused a lot of tension between them. And we brought them together a couple times to try to work it out, because that's what the Bible says in Matthew 18, that you should go to that person and talk. The Bible doesn't say you should go to Facebook and vent anonymously about that person. It doesn't say you should go to your friends and talk about every terrible thing that person has done about you. It says you go to that person. So they did. But what we found was that they were seeing things so differently. It was still so emotionally charged that what we needed was a timeout. And so he said, here's what we're going to do. You guys don't see each other very often, but we want you to be able to see each other and be really great. And so how about we take a month? What if we try this again 4 weeks from now? And we set up an appointment for 4 weeks from now. We just set a length. We're not running away. We're not bailing out. 4 weeks from now, we're going to sit down. One of the best things you can do in a timeout is set a length. Number two, you should be really clear. Be really clear about the purpose of the timeout. Imagine this. We do a lot of marriage counseling around here too, and because we just want to be a place that families go to get better. And we believe families are well served by marriages that are thriving and healthy relationships that are thriving and healthy friendships that are thriving and healthy. And so we do a lot of conversations about marriage. So I just want you to use your imagination for a minute. Imagine that a young couple has just gotten married. They're in their first year of marriage. And let's just say hypothetically, I know this has never happened in the history of the world, but let's just say hypothetically that one of those people comes from a family where fights are very loud and very expressive, right? Where words are thrown in all kinds of different directions at various volumes, sometimes at the same time, and then 30 minutes later, everything's fine and everybody's best friends. Just I know no families probably still work like that, but just in case, okay? Just hypothetically, some of those really messed up people, you know? And then there's these other equally messed up people who, when their fights in their family are very precise, and every word is calculated and sometimes very cutting. And every single word that is said, each person is accountable for, because it will be written down on that person's conscience and kept track of until the end of the world. Every word matters. And let's just say in the first year of the marriage that these two enter their first time of intense fellowship, okay? That they have disagreed miraculously about something. Apparently the honeymoon's over, and now there's a disagreement, and they decide to fight. And they bring all of that with them into this fight, right? That is a recipe for not awesome. Okay, we're just going to put that in the not awesome category. And so one of them says, that's it. I can't take it. I'm out of here. That can mean a lot of things, right? And both, as one walks off and one stays, can draw very different conclusions about what that means. Brene Brown, a couple years ago at the Leadership Summit, said that when there are gaps in our understanding of a story, our brains are hardwired to fill in the gaps with theories. And I don't know about you, but I don't know a lot of people who always fill those gaps with the best theories. Fear wells up, accusation wells up, division wells up, and so it just creates a hotbed for awfulness. But just suppose for a second that this person was trying to take a timeout, and instead of saying, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here, they said this. Listen, I don't know where to go from here, and so I just need a breath. I really want our marriage to be great, but I don't know how to do that right now, so I need a little bit of space to think about this, and let's try again in a little while. Do you hear the difference? When you're clear about the purpose, it's like a timeout in football where the point is to come back and to be more effective, to be in a better place to do what is needed in that moment. There was an expression of a desire for things to be great, and there was a time limit put on it, and there was a purpose added to it. It's very different things. It's not a power-up control move trying to manipulate. Instead, it's I want to bring my best. I need this to help me bring my best. Y'all with me so far? Timeouts need to be well thought out. Now, the terrible thing about having to preach or talk to y'all about this kind of stuff is that I'm faced all week with how terrible I am at it. And so, I could make a list of the times where God still has space to help me along in this because I mess it up. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that with someone I was in, we were in a certain conflict, and it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. And they actually did. They asked for a timeout. They didn't use those words. They just said, listen, we just need to try this again because I'm not going to say anything helpful right now. And you know what I did? I powered up. I'm like, well, I want to know right now. You don't get a timeout. You're out of timeouts. We're doing this now. It's terrible. What a mess to put someone in a position where they know, they've even said, I'm not going to be helpful right now. And let me just, I know this will shock you, but what they said next was not helpful. It just wasn't. They were so right. And then I added to the unhelpfulness, right? It's just bad. So listen, this is bonus. There's no blank for this, but maybe you just give people the freedom for a timeout. Give people space for a timeout. Assume that they actually want the best and they're trying to bring their best and that what they're asking for would help them. The reason I didn't give this person a timeout is because of what I wanted. And by the way, I think we all know this, that when we only bring our own concerns to a relationship, that relationship is bound to go bad. And all I was worried about in that moment was me. Instead, I should have allowed space. Number 3, if you're going to take a timeout, make it count. Make it count. Give it purpose. When I called timeout and brought over those 11, 14-year-olds to the side, we didn't talk about the weekend. We didn't talk about their math homework. You know, we didn't just waste that time. We made it count. We talked about what mattered so that we were prepared to come back in. And so a little bit here, we're going to spend just a little bit of time on how do you make a timeout count? When those people who are kind of in a conflict that we said, let's pause for a month, we gave very direct purpose for that month, saying, hey, we made a list of some things, and you'll see some of those things on the list. But as you step into a timeout, the very best thing that you can do is ask God for wisdom and help. Ask God for wisdom and help. The half-brother of Jesus said it this way, that if any of us lacks wisdom, that's me, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously without finding fault, right? And so we ask him for wisdom. As interested as you are in your relationships being great, God is infinitely more interested. In fact, we sang about this earlier, that Leaves the 99 song, that reckless love that he has for us. He has that for us. And he knows our lives, when relationships thrive, our life looks more and more like he always intended for it to look. He loves us. He wants those things to be really, really great. And guess what? That person that's across from you in the argument, who you are convinced is like Satan in the flesh and they're your enemy right now, God loves them too. He's crazy about them and he wants the best for them too. And so we ask God for help, not just for us, but for the other person in this argument, that he'll help us. Now listen, if you're here and you don't really know about this whole God thing, or you're not sure about Jesus, or you're checking this thing out on the line, trying to figure out if this is you, the truth is that these proverbs are rooted in wisdom and life, and they'll help you no matter what. You apply them, they'll absolutely help you forward. You'll be more skillful in relationships than ever. But God says that in our weakness, he is strong. And when we trust him, he adds more strength to our lives than we could ever add on our own. No matter how much skill or effort or whatever we try to develop, there's no comparing to God's work in our lives. That when Jesus gave his life to reconnect us with God, it wasn't just to wipe a clean slate, though that's true. It was also so that God could live in our lives, that the Holy Spirit could be in us and give us the strength that we need to be the kind of people that he always imagined for us to be. And so when we ask him for help, we can trust him to come through. That if we fill our minds, like we've been reading each day a chapter of this, if we fill our minds with wisdom, the Spirit will call those things to mind at just the right time to need them. He'll give us the strength to actually do the right thing. And instead of popping off and being sarcastic, he'll actually say something helpful like timeout. And you'll be like, whoa, why did I do that? Because God helped you. Over and over and over. I bet if you're sitting around someone who's been following Jesus for a long time, they could tell you 3, 4 stories like that, where they did something because God prompted them to do it that they never would have known to do on their own. Ask God for help. But then make it count as well by asking yourself and God a few questions. Now, you may have a better list of questions than this, but here are some of my questions that I try to ask in the timeout. Number 1, what's at the center of this issue? So someone has said something, seems wrong, seems offensive, seems hurtful, seems uninformed, seems bad, but in that moment, it is so hard to respond well to that. So if you call timeout, you can back up and say, wait. What's at the center of this issue? Before I back up, when someone says something offensive or surprising to me, you know what I think the issue is? That person. My issue's got a face and a name, and it's yours. You know what I'm saying? That's just how it is. And so all of a sudden now we are adversaries when we're supposed to, like, this is the relationship we're trying to work on. But now an issue has popped up, and all of a sudden now I've made you my enemy, and you're the issue, right? And that's usually what happens. Like when I take that time from listening to speaking and shrink it, the things that come out of my mouth are not reflective of the relationship that I'm in. But if I back up, I can be a little more rational. I can take fight or flight off the table for a few minutes and be a little bit more rational. Instead of attacking or running away, I can think through, wait a minute, what was at the center of the issue? Because maybe what I felt like was an accusation in that moment was just a call for help. Maybe what I thought was what they had said wasn't actually what they meant to say. What I heard wasn't what they said. I got it wrong. Crazy to imagine that I would get it wrong. But they tried their best to say it. I didn't hear it right, and my response in that moment would not be helpful. So I can back up and say, wait. What's at the center of this issue? Maybe it was a missed expectation. Anybody have expectations that don't get met? Anyone? Anyone have unexpressed expectations that don't get met? Yeah, we know when we find those in other people, right? It's like a landmine. You stepped on it. You had no idea it was there, but they let you know, you know? We do our best. We don't always even know ourselves well enough to know what the expectation is, but we know when it's not met. So there may not even be any fault in that. It's just reality. And if this relationship is going to thrive, we've got to create some space for that. Because the truth is, me attacking that person or you attacking that person or attacking each other, that's just a whole nother issue that we've added to whatever the issue was to begin with. And the truth is, in Ephesians, that Paul says it this way, that our battle is not against flesh and blood. That we don't fight against people, we fight for people. And we fight for the relationship. They're not the enemy. The problem with winning and losing is that somebody loses. And you know who always loses? The relationship that existed between the two of you. It's not helpful. Instead, like a counselor once told me, if you can externalize the problem just a little bit, take it a little less personally, and instead of receiving everything that person is saying as if it is your fault, instead just set it out on the table and look at it side by side and attack the issue together instead of attacking one another. You know when that's really hard to do? In the blink of an eye. You know when it's easier to do? When you call a timeout. It's easier to set that down and say, okay, how do we go at that together? You know what'll build a relationship? Attacking problems together instead of attacking one another. Helps us. It helps us if we can set that down and go at the issue together instead of at each other. So what's at the center of the issue? Number 2, how am I contributing to the problem? I know for me in the moment, this is just confession day apparently, but when someone offends me, I have a really hard time seeing how I'm contributing to the problem, but I can give that person a list, you know? I'll tell you all the things and the finger comes out and it's like, you just can't stop it, right? It's not helpful. But when I step back, when I call a timeout, now I can think a little bit better. Wait. How have I been contributing to this issue? And how could I contribute more to the solution? Maybe their issue, they even feel like it's my fault. But if I can just take that off the table for just a second and get to the need, the center of the issue that is unmet in them, we can work together at how to help them meet that need that they have that's totally legit. It's totally valid. We can step back and do that. Another question you might ask is, what needs to change in me moving forward? Again, I'm super good at a moment's notice telling how other people need to change so we can move forward. But when I step back, it helps give me some time to take my pride off the table for a few minutes, take my emotion off the table for a few minutes, and think, wait. This conflict is revealing something about me. And this is a little crazy, but that's actually a time to be grateful to God that he's revealing something in us that he's willing to work on in us so it doesn't get carried into our next conversation or our next relationship. In fact, Ruth Haley Barton talked about this, that conflict, when handled really well, can be transformational. That conflict is actually one of the primary ways that relationship moves forward. When it's done really well, when you go through those challenges together and you fight together instead of each other, it solidifies the relationship. And so we shouldn't be afraid of conflict. Conflict is not an indication to run. Conflict is not an indication to attack. Conflict is a time to say, time out, let's go at this together. And so we get to think about that a little bit differently. Or this last question, what's the next step for our relationship to really thrive? Isn't that what we want? Everyone wants our relationships to be great. I don't want to get in an argument with my kids and let them know how wrong they are and make them feel small. I want us to have a phenomenal relationship. So how do we do this in a way how do I figure out what the next best step is? And usually it's not me yelling. That's not usually how the best next step, right? That's not how it works. With our friends, just distance or all those other things, that's not the best next step. How do we figure out the best next step? That's hard to do like that. It's easier to do like this, to step back and figure it out. Because in that moment, maybe this is just because I'm a guy, I don't really know, not to be too chauvinist, but I have this like go-to tool anytime there's conflict that I try to use every single time, you know? Kind of like to hammer everything's a nail, you know what I mean? And so when I get into a conflict and somebody brings a problem to me, I just tell them how to fix it in the next 30 seconds and then we're good, right? Anyone? Well, just fix it. We'll just fix it. Let me just tell you how to fix that. Let's fix it. We'll fix it right now. Right? Some guys are laughing because you tried it. That tool just doesn't work. Like 90% of the time. And we're so convinced it's going to. It's not. You know why? Because fixing the problem isn't the point of the relationship. Problem-free life is not the point of relationship. Living well together is the point of the relationship. And sometimes the very best thing that we can do, and I forget this all the time, some of the times the very best thing we can do is just sit next to those people in the problem and just empathize and understand and just sit next to them. There's a book in the Old Testament called Job where this guy's life was just totally falling apart. And his friends at the beginning of that book, it says that they just sat in the ashes with him. And they got it so right. And then for the next 35 chapters, they screw it up because they opened their mouths. Sometimes we just need to sit. But here's the thing, is that requires sacrifice, right? It requires discomfort. It requires me to get uncomfortable with somebody. It's called empathy. And truth is, a lot of times, I don't want to be uncomfortable. So I'd rather just stand at a distance and point and tell you how to fix it and then walk away and feel like my job's done. But that's walking away. That's not drawing close. It's not relationship. And so how do we figure out what the right next step is? A timeout can really help. One other question we didn't ask is this: what do I still not understand? Believe it or not, as hard as people around you might try, they might not say it right the first time. Anybody ever do that? Where you try to express something really hard or confrontational or hurtful to somebody and you totally screw it up, and then they take that and misunderstand it in a totally wrong direction, and now the miscommunication is 10 times bigger than you thought it could be. Sometimes a timeout can help us come back and say, wait, here's what I understood, is that right? And they're like, nope, that's not even close. And then you go, whew. Instead of assuming you got it right, going on attack or flight mode, and all of a sudden, we're going nowhere. A timeout could really help us. In fact, if you're convinced, even if you look at your own experience that a timeout might help, maybe you could just try this week. Rethink a recent conflict. Call to mind a recent conflict with people. Just rethink it. Think through it one more time. How did that go? Why did I do that? Why did it go that way? Why did they say that way? Why did they handle it that way? Just rethink it. If possible, like if you and this person are still amiable and it won't turn into a fist fight, you should probably just sit down with them and just say, hey, let's rethink this together. What if I had done this? What would you have done? Or if I had handled it this way, how would that have gone? Oh man, I wish I hadn't handled it that way. I'm so sorry I handled it that way. Let's figure out how to do it like this. Could be a phenomenal conversation. That's the kind of transformation that could happen in our relationships. Number 2, you could use the questions that are on here to think through a conflict that you are in right now. Now, I'm sure that none of you watching online or here in the room are in a conflict right now. I'm 100% sure that none of you had an argument in the vehicle on the way to church, and then magically, when it got put in park, the engine turned off and the door opened and someone saw you, you're like, hey, we're the greatest family ever. Look how polished we are. Our shoes match. Everyone's clean, and we're so happy to be at church today. I'm sure no one did that today. But just in case somebody did, just in case maybe you're in the middle of like a forced timeout on this little conflict that's going on in your world, and the moment you get back in that car and shut the doors and no one can hear you again, all that tension comes right back in the vehicle with you. Maybe you could just take the walk between here and there and think about some of those questions and rethink things just a little bit. Or maybe you could get back in the car and say, I don't like how that went. Can we call a timeout and talk about this a little bit later? Or number 3, maybe you should call a timeout or 2 this week when you don't desperately need it. Right? When the big argument hits, you want to be ready. You want to be the kind of person who knows how to call a timeout. So find some like mid-level, low-level arguments, stuff that doesn't matter at all, like the cap on the toothpaste or something like that. And it's called, can we call a timeout and talk about what? And anyway, like just, because here's the thing. When you go skiing for the first time, you don't start on the double black diamond. You take a few trips down the bunny hill. You know what I'm saying? Because you're going to fall down. It's not going to go well the first few times. But maybe this week you could find a few bunny hills and call a few timeouts. See how that goes and start to build a little bit of a track record for pushing pause. Because here's the truth. I know I can, and I bet you can, call to mind a lot of conversations, maybe with the person you're sitting next to, maybe with your parents, with your children, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, where things escalated quickly when a timeout would have helped so much. That a few strategic timeouts in your relationship could serve you really well. If you could just stretch out that time between listening and speaking, things would go so much better. Like when you call a tight end reverse on 3rd down, you score and you win and you live in infamy. Yeah, I know you all read about it in the paper. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's fine. It's all very life-altering stuff. The truth is our relationships are, and they'd be really well served by a timeout. Would you stand and pray with me? And so just real quickly, I just want to speak a blessing over all of us, kind of a confident prayer in God that things would go the way He wants in our lives. But first, I just want to remind you that Serve Day is such a blessing where we can take our strength, our good strength, and make a difference in people. So I want to encourage you to jump in on that. And camps, it's such a big deal in our kids' lives. And finally, if there's specific things we can pray about, we'll be down front, in the back, or out in the corner. We'd love to connect with you. But as you leave, may God give all of us the strength and the humility and the patience and especially the wisdom to push pause in conflict when we need to. May He give us great favor in all of our relationships, that we would be the kind of parent, child, neighbor, coworker, supervisor, boss, every relationship that we're in, that He would give us the strength to be the very best of those that we can. And as we engage His word this week, may He speak the exact things into us that we need in this season of our life, so that we can live really well with other people and live really well enjoying our God. In Jesus' name, amen. Have an awesome week.